This is a huge honor, a huge pleasure. I am so excited to have Michael Hames-García here with me to talk Latinx studies in action. Michael, welcome.
Hi, welcome, or thank you.
So tell us a little bit about your journey. And, I'm so, like many of us watching this right now, how did you get to where you are? How did your path lead you to become a teacher, scholar, activist, working in this kind of intersection of race, sexuality, gender, social justice?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, because I'm like at the tail end of a generation that could have gone to college and not known what Latino studies was. um, I, I think I read when I read Gloria Anzaldúa and Terry Moraga in a class. It was called Minority Studies Seminar, as an undergraduate. And other than that, I don't think I read anything by a Chicano or Chicana in college. It wasn't really, I wasn't really aware of it as a thing that existed. And so I went to graduate school in English to study post-colonial studies and queer studies and and then I arrived and realized that you could say Chicanos. What's more, we hired, or Cornell's English department hired during my first year there, Ben Olguín, who had done his dissertation at Stanford on Pinto poets. And so I did an independent study with him as soon as he arrived, and I further realized, oh, so that's something you can do too. That was my introduction to sort of politically engaged critical work. And I knew pretty quickly, I figured out pretty quickly this was the mid 90s or early 90s, early mid 90s. The Clinton White House and the Biden Gingrich Congress was creating the what would become known as the Clinton crime bills, and things were already pretty bad for people of color with regard to incarceration and criminal justice, but it was clear that they were going to get worse. Activists on the ground knew that this was a bad thing, and this was also around the time that the first three strikes laws were passed in California, and the first mandatory minimum laws in Washington State. And so it was, I knew as I began to move toward dissertation writing that what I wanted to do with my studies was something related to mass incarceration, what we now call mass incarceration. We just called it incarceration then. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I got started.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense now. You sharing this kind of moment of synergy when Ben, kind of arrived and you're there, growing as a scholar, thinker, activist person. Now I completely see it. And then, of course, reclaiming identity, which came before Fugitive Thought. We're going to talk about it in just a minute, but definitely, you and Paula and the kind of important work that was going on there. But let me ask, so in 2004, if I got that right, you have Fugitive Thought, and then and then you have Identity Complex, much more sort of current, 2015, but it's still very much, what changed or stayed the same or became more intense for you when thinking about, carceral industrial complex, Black, Latinx political and social thinkers social identities in social justice, as well as philosophies of justice and freedom. I know these are areas that you work very directly in.
Yeah. Let's see. Thinking again back to the 90s. So there was also a time when English departments were kind of breaking wide open. So it was possible to study pretty much anything in an English department in the 90s. And as I understand it, they have kind of closed back up in the 21st century and become more conservative, more restricted in terms of how they imagine their object of study. And so I kind of lucked into a department where I was allowed to do half my coursework outside of English. My requirements for my degree were pretty much decided between myself and my committee. There were no hoops really, and so it was thoroughly interdisciplinary. Very engaged with philosophy, very engaged with historical sociology, and when I landed in the English department for my first job, I realized that I really didn't have anything as much in common with a Shakespeare scholar as I did with a sociologist or a political scientist who was studying race. And so I just kept moving farther and farther afield. So Fugitive Thought was grew out of my dissertation and was my first single authored book. And it is fairly literary. It's got some, I feel like I equip myself well as a literary scholar there. Although it's also pretty philosophical. Identity complex and some of the other works that you mentioned is me kind of pushing the boundaries there more toward what I invented a name for my method. It was empirically informed theoretical humanities, where essentially reading voraciously empirical studies and sociology, psychology, criminology, anthropology, ethnography, but not really using those methods. The methods remain much more interpretive, historical, and so hence theoretical humanities. But so what I wanted to do with identity complex was really to think about enough. I mean, there's kind of, if you're familiar with it, there's sort of like a race chapter and a gender chapter and a sexuality chapter, and the gender chapter is supposed to focus on masculinity, and so in each of those, my goal is to push on those identities and kind of refract the ways in which, right, if we're thinking about masculinity and incarceration, right, and representation in chapter 4, that is inseparable from thinking about ability and disability, from race and sexuality and right, all these things shape how masculinity and incarceration have dovetailed together, right? So so that book is really trying to just push conversations that I saw happening in the humanities in further. Yeah, I don't know if that addressed the question, but.
Oh yeah, no, really powerful and insightful, Michael, and empirically informed theoretical humanities. Empirical, there is something I think both you and I share in our work. At a certain moment, maybe this was a result of the graduate student moment when we were in graduate school, but a drive to kind of anchor in material reality and be informed very much by the kind of material reality. and yet at the same time still grapple with, as you conceive it here, you know, the theoretical humanities. But yeah, so identity politics, because, you know, identity politics in many ways, at least for me in the 90s, I was really trying to like take us somewhere new, I think. And if I'm reading you and Paula's work in that period, especially the reclaiming identity, it seemed also to kind of want to drive to that, to a place of anchoredness in the material reality. But maybe you can talk about that, and you can tell me I got it all wrong. And then also this really cool collection, Identity Politics Reconsidered.
Yeah. So no, I think you're right. I think it's you know, it was I try to explain this to students that I have now, graduate students, and I say, well, because they'll read some of my early work, and I'll say, well, the thing you have to understand about that is that we were intentionally polemical in reclaiming identity, because we felt that we had to be. I would not write some of those things the same way today. Not because I don't still believe any of them, but because the inertia of the humanities at that point, and you know, not all humanities, but certainly literature, the inertia was so tilted toward a subjectivist slant. See, I almost said relativist, and that would be the polemical, but a subjectivist slant. There was and there are all kinds of historical reasons for that. We could have a nice amends-making conversation with postmodernists about, you know, where we think in common, but the effect for someone like me, and I think this was true for Paula and possibly for you, very much motivated by a political impetus.
We wanted it to be grounded in the matter.
Yeah, in some sense of why it mattered that we were in graduate school, people like us. I was very aware that Cornell only admitted the number of Chicanos and African Americans it did because of affirmative action. It wasn't because Cornell thought that we would be great additions. It's because there had been protests, and there had been laws passed, and otherwise it would still be an all-white university, probably, or mostly white. So I had a sense of inequality as being something that existed in the world, and I wanted to be able to talk about it. And I felt like the theoretical tools I was given in graduate school didn't allow me to. So Paula and I found language that allowed us to do that. And it's not the only language. I've come across others since, and one of the ones that I think is one of the discourses that I would say is probably the most influential in my work, in my recent work, is the colonial modern gender system, right? Growing out of historical sociology of Anzaldúa and folks like that, really bonus.
Really, really, really powerful. And thank you for sharing that journey. I know that it'll be important, especially for, you know, future gen scholars, professors, Latinx, Chicanx coming up to hear this process that you went through. Michael, you've also made really important critical interventions and cleared new spaces within, and, you know, not just within, but actually clearing them for Latinx Joteria studies. Can you tell us a little bit about how this, you know, work comes from, where it comes from, where you're going, or, you know, all of this stuff?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You know, I remember having a conversation with Juanita Diaz Coto, also known as Juanita Ramos, early on when I first my first job in New York, and she said that she's has sort of over the course of her career done like do a queer book, and then she'll do a prison book, and then do a queer book, and then do a prison book. And I didn't explicitly decide to copy her, but I kind of have, insofar as I don't see these bodies of scholarship as separate, but in some ways the audiences for them are separate. And so the Gay Latino Studies book was definitely one of the gay book, and or an identity book. And this project emerged because it didn't exist. I remember sitting around with a couple friends and thinking, and saying, you know, this needs to exist. And so we decided to make it. And we had no idea what it was going to look like when we started. But it's turned out to be easily the most well received thing that I've done, or widely received. People, I've had weird experiences of showing up to, you know, like a gay bar in LA, and someone coming up and telling me that their friend said that they read me in their class, and they need to say hi to me. It's not sort of normal things. But it's I'm really glad that this book has been as impactful as it has been. We made a deliberate decision to include a wide range of perspectives in it. People who don't agree with each other at all, but reflect part of the conversation in Coteria studies and in Gay Latino studies. And I think that decision was probably the best one we made in putting this together, because it really does reflect a the field as a conversation, and not as a it's not a polemic. This book is not polemical, except insofar as it's asserting existence.
Mm-hmm. And a Lambda Award winner too,
Yeah.
no less. Yes, no, I think you're right. It's the broad appeal, but without sacrificing depth and sophistication, right? So incredible. You're obviously, we know you're multi-award winning professor, and students, you're beloved, you're loved. What is the Michael Hames-García method approach in the classroom, if you were to kind of like distill it down?
Oh God. I don't know. I make lots of bad jokes, and then I laugh at them myself, so that students don't have to feel bad that they're not laughing. Self-deprecation, I guess, like all of the normal Latinx strategies. But seriously, like I try to engage students as much as possible. You know, I teach classes. One of my signature classes at Oregon has been this 150 student social equity and criminal justice, which has evolved. You know, it's never the same twice, because things keep changing, right, around policing and prisons. I have students in there who are taking their exams to become sheriff's officers, as well as students who are radical activist organizer students and abolitionists. And my goal with that class is to have those students talk to each other, because it's the only time they will. They're not people who are going to have serious, informed conversations about sex offender registries and mandatory arrests after domestic violence and racial profiling. They're not going to have those conversations with each other unless they have them in that class. And so I try to set up the conditions for those conversations to happen. And so far, no fights have broken out. Closest I came was these Dominican and Puerto Rican women who almost went to blows over Junot Diaz's work. That was a long time ago, though, back in New York.
Yeah, so important too, what you're doing there. In fact, maybe, anticipating and then of course amplifying the Black Lives Matter movement, and everybody kind of getting behind real serious police reform. But of course that has to happen in these spaces that you just described. So important, right? Wow. Teaching by other means, Michael. So you're not just in the classroom doing this work. You're out there. You're doing this. You're doing it. The organic intellectual, if we want to use that. But that seems a little passé to me. But yeah. So tell me about that, teaching by other means for you.
Yeah. It's funny. I feel like I don't recognize myself in that picture where I'm wearing the suit. That's definitely other means. Yeah, I think that I've tried really hard to be able to talk about what I care about in my research to anyone, and that's partly happened because of the classes that I've taught. So I'm currently on Eugene Civilian Review Board, reviewing investigations into police misconduct. And those are public meetings. I want to be able to articulate what I think in those contexts in a way that is going to be heard by members of the public who show up, as well as other board members and officers who show up. But yeah, I also there was a debate at the City Club for Eugene there, and I like giving public talks. That was me in the lower left there, giving a history of prison protests in front of the Lane County Jail with a big speaker so that folks inside could hear. So I believe in trying to speak with people and I talk to whoever I can. I've taught in prisons. I talk to people. If you work on something like policing or prisons, you'll find yourself in conversations in the checkout lane, on airplanes, waiting for the bus. People have thoughts, and I'm not here to tell them that they're wrong. I'm here to give them context for why they think what they think, and to ask them questions and get them to think about it. So that's what I do.
So important. Yeah, listening carefully and then providing that depth, that information, the depth, the context that, might inform and maybe even kind of reshape some of the things, that they're thinking about or that they have opinions about. You're also very invested, very centered, rooted in the community on campus, the Latinx scholars, academic residential community I'm thinking about. And yeah, how is what you work, how you work in the community we just talked about, and then how you're kind of in these spaces on campus, how did they reflect and amplify what you're doing?
Yeah, I love that. Rosa, I love that picture. So Latinx Scholars ARC was or is a sort of a Latinx themed residence unit on campus, and it wasn't my idea. It was something that a number of the staff, the student services staff on campus, student advisors, wanted to create. And I just did what I could to support their vision. It needed a faculty director, and it seemed important that the faculty director be both Latinx and tenured and senior, at least to begin with. And I was really happy to do what I could. And then it's becomes infectious, like because these student advisors, like, they care about the students so much, and it was really easy to work with them and to sign on to their agenda and care about it, and really work hard to make that happen. So it was a joy for me last year to be the first director for that. We had I want to say 30 first year Latinx students all living together in the same floor of a residence hall, taking a class with me, taking another class with me all year long, and doing a bunch of cool things like printmaking with Kilda Posada. We chose an work of art for the museum by a Latinx artist. We did not get to do an off-campus field trip because it was going to be in the spring and coronavirus. But it was just wonderful. I love that kind of connection with students, and particularly first year students. And it's really easy when you're a senior professor to not teach first year students. And I've made a point of teaching first year students pretty much every year for the last almost 15 years. Because there's nothing like the energy you get from them. They're so enthusiastic about whatever you give them. And I love that.
Yeah, really. I'm with you on that completely. And yeah, it is amazing. It's almost like a model for all universities to follow, right? We need this everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it would really change the kind of water that we drink in spaces of higher education, right?
I'm gonna miss that residence community when I moved to Texas next year. As part of what made the move hard.
Yeah, I imagine. Where for you, Michael, today is the vitality in Latinx studies?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that there's two things that I think are present and that I see in Latinx studies today that I didn't see when I was starting my career, that weren't really present. And the first of those is the synergy that I think takes place among people from different Latinx groups, right? So, back in the day, we had Chicano studies, we had Puerto Rican studies, there was, whispers of Dominican studies or Central American studies, but Latino studies really was only an umbrella for those different things to be grouped separately. But now you have people who are doing work on communities, who are organizing in communities that are thoroughly multi-Latinx. And what's happening is that there is an identity and a culture, I think, that's distinctively estadounidense, right? It's distinctively U.S. that is U.S. Latino. That I don't think, I think we could have speculated about it 20 years ago, but now it actually exists, and it's cool, and I think there's people working there, particularly in cultural studies and art and literature, and that's very cool. The other thing I would say would be people who are working on border issues. So, border studies has been with us forever, but it's I think in the last 4 years in particular, it's taken on a new urgency, and the atrocities that are happening in detention centers and with repatriations, and there's so much there around this complex, and it emerges. It's easy to mistake Trump and Stephen Miller and the Republicans as the agents of this, but it's a point I make when I talk about immigration in my classes. I make a point of using Obama era footage because there's a disdain for Latinx immigrants that is bipartisan, and there is no policy of the last 4 years that does not have its roots in the previous 8, and that's challenging that, questioning that, fighting that, I think is probably the main challenge that we have in Latinx studies today.
Absolutely. Michael, I don't know if you're at liberty to talk a little bit or give us a little teaser to this new work that you are doing. I know you've got plans to be in different important cities in the country to do this research. Are you at liberty to share a little bit?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm currently working on studying community oversight of law enforcement. And so I had picked out this topic a year ago, and unbeknownst to me, now everyone cares about it. So who knew? But for a while, community oversight or civilian oversight of law enforcement was something that was kind of existed in the shadows, and people sort of, for the most part, didn't know it existed. If they did know it existed, they didn't really know what it did or what it involved. But now people are, it's the subject of many people's demands. City of Portland just passed a measure to revamp there's community oversight. Los Angeles County just in 2016 became one of the first counties to have civilian oversight for its sheriff's department. Most civilian oversight in this country exists at the city level. So for city police, not for federal agencies, not for state police, not for county sheriffs. And then within that, most civilian oversight is fairly new. It almost always emerges right after some kind of crisis. So there's a riot, there's a murder by police of an unarmed Black person or brown person, and there's an outcry, and the result is a civilian review board or a citizen complaint board or a community oversight committee. What they do typically is provide a check on procedures. And so it's very much a vision of procedural justice. And so what I'm doing is interviewing people, 40 people in the Eugene area, 40 in Los Angeles County, and 40 in British Columbia, who are involved with either formal civilian oversight, as I am on the Civilian Review Board, or informally, who are involved in community organizations, protesting the police, or investigative journalists, or what have you. And asking people what they believe is at stake, what they want oversight of law enforcement to provide, and what they think oversight of law enforcement is providing. And I think it basically comes down to this tension or this disjuncture, this divide between procedural justice, which lawyers are very good at devising systems to give us procedural justice, and substantive justice, which is what communities typically want. People want, they want a sense that the police have face consequences when they do wrong. That's not what they get. So the title of the project is Not What We Had in Mind, because typically the kinds of structures that are set up to provide oversight are not what activists and communities had in mind when they asked for something.
Right, yeah, that disconnect, taking us back to that your social justice, critical justice studies course, where you're bringing, you know, people into the same space, right? We need kind of more of that work. Michael, thank you. This has been a huge honor for me to learn from you right now, to hear about your journey, both as a scholar, as someone with boots on the tarmac, on the street, in these different critical spaces, doing the work that you're doing. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. It was fun.